Hi, everyone. Welcome to my topics. I'll be covering global bias in AI. So this is mostly about when Western data shapes the world. Also, if you notice, my slides will have a certain theme. And at the end of my presentation, if you can guess what the theme is, then I don't know, you don't win an award, but it's just nice. So a bit about what I do as a day job. So my name is Masuma Shariff. You'll see it across the top of my presentation slides. And I work as a security and compliance associate consultant. So I mainly deal with helping organizations strengthen their security and compliance to do with data security. And I work for Advania UK. So they're a Microsoft service provider company, and I've only been in the corporate world for 2 years. So I'm very new compared to a few others in the crowd. So a bit nervous, but it's fine. And Advania actually has offices in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, the UK, and South Africa. So it's a pretty good, geography. About me on the side, thank you. I like making art. Again, I won't say what type of art because it gives away my favorite artist. And I also like talking about tech. So I mostly talk about cybersecurity and about women in tech, how to break into tech. So talking about AI is something very different for me. And if I do make any mistakes, come talk to me after, please. Don't like say it as a question. Also, if you have any accessibility issues, for example, you can't hear or some of the visuals are difficult, just come to me after. More than happy to go through the slides again and also share them with you. So about me. So let's dive in. You'll notice 3 pins on the map. That's actually where I'm from. So I grew up in Tanzania, studied in Malaysia, and I now live in the UK, specifically Manchester. So if you're a football fan, I'm not, don't get the hype. But one thing I've learned staying in all these countries is how different everything is, you know. So for example, corporate culture in Malaysia is very chill. So when I did my internship, I would literally be playing card games with the CEO himself. Whereas in the UK, there's a very clear distinction between who's a leader and who isn't. And this is basically known as culture shock. And a lot of us actually do experience it. And increasingly, with technology, obviously, billions of people use it every day, and that's specifically AI. And the same AI diagnoses illnesses, who deserves a loan, who gets an interview, because nowadays we have hiring AIs, and also organizes your photographs. So this was literally built, when I say this, I mean AI. AI was literally built in one of these worlds, and it was deployed to all of them. So today I want to explore what happens and why that matters. So I will be sharing some case studies as we go along. They might be a bit wordy, so I will be looking at my slides, and I will also be open to your different perspectives after the talk. So before we actually go into the case studies, I just want to share 3 personal anecdotes about my experience with technology. So the first one being my dad versus Alexa. So my dad really wanted an Alexa for his birthday, so I got him one with my big girl paycheck. And my dad actually speaks 6 languages, so his accent is very different compared to what people usually expect. So he has an international accent, and it's not very easy to understand sometimes. And you can imagine what happens when he's trying to tell Alexa a very simple prompt. When he asks her for the news, she starts playing some random podcast. Or when he asks her for what's the weather like in Tanzania, our country, she tells us about the weather in some random Tasmania place. So he has actually adapted to Alexa itself, but the sad part is that Alexa has not really adapted to him. And that's kind of what I will be covering later on. The second story is about your home language or your mother tongue. So being an international in the UK, I think internationals, we tend to kind of attract other international people. So we're basically magnets. And I even make a joke, and I've had a few groups actually named the UN, because all my friends are from across the world. And we've noticed, and I was having this conversation with some of my friends, that AI is very awkward when you talk to it in your mother language. For example, I have this one friend, she's from Nigeria, and in passing I just kind of asked her, bro, when you speak in your home language to AI, do you usually get like a very different answer? And she told me that she completely avoids it because it usually takes it out of context. So it will give her the wrong answer compared to what she actually wants. So AI just never gets what you're trying to say unless you tell it something in English, which I'm assuming a few of you people have also faced an issue with. And the third issue is book reviews. So in no way, shape, or form am I an editor or a book reviewer. This is just my personal opinion. Please don't sue me. But there was an instance where I was reading a book, and ironically, the book is called Invisible Women. And some of you have probably heard of that book before, but it just explores about the data bias and the data gap that women have and how they're not taken into consideration in, let's say, the medical field. For example, how much funding actually goes into PCOS, now PMOS, versus how much funding actually goes into why a man gets a man flu. So I barely got through the book when I actually noticed that it's not really like the demographic is very specific, and I say this with as much respect as possible, but the demographic was specifically middle-class white women, which I clearly am not. And I was having this conversation with my aunt, and I'm like, you know what? I feel like the book Invisible Women is very invisible for me. And she's like, let's just find a book review or like feedback online. And we did. And we actually found one single review that agreed with what I was saying. But then a single review doesn't really do justice, especially as someone that likes looking into fairness and equality. So we asked AI, what do you think? And you won't believe what it said. For some reason, none of our AIs could understand why we were not being represented in the book. So coincidentally, this was all done in the same hour, by the way. We asked Copilot, we asked GPT, and all of them just said, seems like something's wrong, and just try again later. So, also a funny joke. Can you guess who the technical person is, just from those screenshots? And if you thought it's the person who has dark mode on, then you are correct. So, these incidents are not necessarily dramatic. Like, no one really, I don't know, went through a big issue, right? They did not get a loan declined, or they did not get denied, health care, or they didn't lose their job. But when we change the scale of the problem, we will realize that it's actually a big issue. So, just to put into scale the geometry of the problem, approximately 49% of all the content online is in English, right? How many people here actually speak a second language or an additional language? Yeah, same. I speak 5 languages, so it's very different. Whereas English speakers, from literally the crowd itself, are approximately 17% of the world population. Let me give you some data. So, over 1.1 billion speakers, that is those people that speak English as an additional language, whilst native speakers are around 370 million people. So roughly 4.5% of the global population actually speaks English as their only language. So before a model is even trained, and by model I mean an AI model, we already have a nearly 30-point representation gap. And that's a lot. It really puts it into perspective. So, I also was just having some fun. Wikipedia, which is mainly used for training, has 7.1 million articles in English. And does anyone want to guess how many articles there are in Danish? Ballpark figure? No? No, surprisingly, it's quite high. In the hundreds, thousands, yes. So, well, 314,000 compared to 7 million. And I'm guessing a few of you people actually do speak Danish, so that's how much of your information online is actually trained, is using to train, actually. So I came across this really cool Substack, and currently obsessed with Substack. Literally just delete all your social media, get Substack, Pinterest, and Spotify, and you're sorted for the week. And the Substack article basically just summarized that data is not neutral, it's actually a cultural artifact. And in some way or the other, it's actually a footprint, it's the history and the blind spots of the people that actually gathered that. So right now, those hands are concentrated in a small corner of the globe, and we need to think about how we can change that. So that's the main focus. A bit technical stuff right now. So what happens behind the scenes of all this? And I want to tell you about a job that does not get talked about enough, and it's to do with data too. And this is probably the most important job in this whole supply chain. And it's the person who labels the AI. So a person who labels AI is called data annotator, right? So every time a model learns that this is a face, this is a tumor, this is profanities, this is very explicit content, there is actually a human that made that distinction based on certain guidelines. And as Richard mentioned before, a few of these annotators are actually people from, I don't want to say third world countries, but they are from countries where the conversion rates are a bit lower, right? So this is known as the global south. So these are workers in Kenya, the Philippines, India, most specifically Venezuela too. And they're being paid literally between 1 and 5 cents per label. I mean, that can literally get you nothing in Copenhagen. So these are actually done in platforms like Scale AI, Mechanical Turk, and Appen. And funny story, I almost applied for a job at Appen as a data annotator when I was a university student, because times are tough and we need the extra income, so don't judge. And this is actually very coincidental. So last week, I attended a talk by this woman. She's an investigative AI journalist. Please check out her book. It's amazing. I was literally reading the book yesterday when I was stuck in line for the visa, guys. It's a struggle. And she talked about in great detail about someone named Michael, who she interviewed herself. And you can find the interview on Wall Street Journal. And he was in charge of labeling and annotating data that is known as violent. So when we think of violence, we're like, okay, a few of us are privileged enough to not have been exposed to that. But in this case, Michael was being exposed to extreme amounts of violence because it was his job. So 9 to 5, he's just labeling violence. And this actually affected his mental state. And in the book, Karen actually, and I just read this part yesterday, Karen mentioned that when the company that Michael got the job through, complained to OpenAI that, hey, a few of our workers are actually suffering, guess what OpenAI did? They just scrapped the whole project. 4 projects, which were around 280,000 total, and they did not even pay the company, and the company name was Sama. Okay, that's not working, but basically, oh yeah, it's working, nice. So in 2023, the Time magazine investigation found that Kenyan workers labeling traumatic content for OpenAI were literally paid less than $2 per hour and had no access to mental health support. So that's basically me just summarizing what I said before. And this was also done by the Guardian, where they actually interviewed real-life people. So this is not something that, is just something we can forget about. It's actually someone's life and they're living it. And I don't say this to be pessimistic, I say to be realistic. A lot of people say, why are you so pessimistic? No, it's realism. And when we talk about this in any way, it's to help understand the hands that shape the data, and we need to know that, okay, these are the people that actually did it. So, yeah. 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 It's sadly the way capitalism works is very exploitative, and but thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate it. Um, so yeah, how does the bias actually get into the system? A lot of people say that it just drops in, but it doesn't actually just drop in, and it's not necessarily the people that prompt it or the one, like, you know, ones of thousands of that data. It's actually an accumulation of everything. So for example, in a pipeline, that data does not necessarily get added up, it actually multiplies. So each stage doesn't pass the bias forward unchanged. It scales, and when received, it actually scales into something bigger. So imagine a snowball. When you combine a snowball with 5 other snowballs, you now have a snowball that's 5 times bigger. And that's kind of the problem that we're looking at in terms of data. So the architecture of it all, we have 3 main stuff. So we have data collection, we've got labeling, and we've got training. So for data collection, we actually need to think about who has internet access, who generates content, and who has infrastructure to contribute. And these are a few of the questions that we should be asking when we design something. So for example, my home country, Tanzania, not a lot of people actually use smartphones, right? So compared to maybe, let's say, the UK, every other person has a smartphone device. Whereas back home, I don't know what you guys call them, but we call them kitochi, which literally means a torch, because that's the main use. It's for a torch and to call people. And that's what a lot of people actually use. So before we even write a single line of code, the demographic has already unconsciously been chosen. So that's why we need to be very mindful in that part. The second part, as mentioned, data annotation / labeling. So someone actually has to decide what something means and why it should be called what it is called. For example, what's professional language? What's considered professional hair? All of this is actually something that falls into the biases of every label. And it's easy to think that we don't label the data itself, but if you're a developer, then you know something called an edge case. And usually an edge case is something that you don't really think is something that is the worst possible outcome, right? But in this case, when your data is skewed, that usually means certain groups of people were not represented because in this case, edge case, they were just forgotten on the side, right? So it's small enough to ignore, but it kind of accumulates into something bigger. Sorry if I messed that up, by the way. I'm not a developer. I'm a cybersecurity person. And then next up, we have training. So this is where your data just keeps going, you know, keeps rolling. Now that 5 times snowball just keeps rolling down, down, down the hill. And soon enough, it becomes 100 times bigger. And before you know it, a lot of the bias has actually already become something really big. So something that was underrepresented before completely disappears and is no longer in that data set, okay? And then you move into validation. And no one's actually going to check the size of a snowball that's 100 times big because that's way too much work. And then you test the model. And before you know it, it's deployed to a lot of people. And you've just deployed a snowball that can now kill a whole village, for example. So this is actually something that I saw on Instagram a long time ago, and I was like, you know what, let me add it into the talk. And it's known as model collapse. So when something is so bad, for example, when the model keeps just training itself over and over and over again, it just goes into a feedback loop. And in this case, Associate Professor Yarin Gal actually says that model collapse is the AI equivalent of a feedback loop gone wrong. The more models feed on their own output, the further they drift from reality. So model collapse threatens to create an AI echo chamber, which is where we then get weird stuff, for example, hallucinations, or I don't know if you guys recently saw that Google descriptions actually now, if you tell it describe wrong or remove description, as in describe to remove, it just removes the description and said, okay, done, I've removed description. Whereas you actually just want to understand, okay, what does it remove actually mean in this case? So that's a bad example, but it kind of puts into perspective. For the philosophy people, this is Sisyphus. And Camus actually said, one must imagine Sisyphus happy, right? Because even in the futility of it all, he was still conscious, and he knew what he was pushing, and he could look at the rock and call it absurd. Whereas we have now built a Sisyphus that doesn't know what it's pushing. It's just pushing because it's being told to push. Right? Simple as that. So, the failure was that nobody ever asked who is the data for and who is it not for, because in that case it helps. So I need to speed up a little because my case studies haven't come up yet. So there's actually a term in social science I want to introduce, which is called WEIRD. So it's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And this was actually a term introduced by Heinrich Heine Norenzayan in 2010 to describe how in psychology a small subset of American students was used to describe how a lot of the students actually work. And this is actually an extreme outlier because we know that a small subset doesn't, explain a whole other class of people. So AI has a weird problem, right? And that makes psychology look microscopic. So in this case, small data set used to actually identify what majority of what other people would actually do, and it also claims to understand them all. So, the fun part, case studies, and most of these are based on real-life examples, so if you get bored, I'm sorry. Not my fault. And if you know this music video, by the way, then another plus point for you. So, art and music. So the first case study is actually to do with image recognition, right? So in 2015, there was a software engineer, which is so ironic, who in New York, he opens up Google Photos and he has been sorting pictures from a friend's graduation. And Google's auto-tagging feature has actually filed several photos of him and his friend under the label gorillas. So he tweets it goes viral. Google apologizes within hours, and here is the solution that they made, by the way, very genius. Just remove the classifier gorilla, monkey, and chimp. Simple, done. So they did not even train the system again, and the system was not even able to recognize black faces, so that's already something wrong. And in 2023, actually, the New York Times checked, so they did a research again, and so that's basically 8 years later, right? And these labels are still there. So if you take a picture of a monkey from a zoo, it would not recognize that that's a monkey. So that's still a shortcoming on that side. So the system was not cured. It was actually just silenced. And a lot of data sets have the similar issues. So there is someone known as Joy Boalamwini, and she actually created something called gender shades because she was not recognized by AI systems, so she's a black lady, and AI would either misgender her as a man or would just not recognize her face, but then when it was a white friend, they'd be like, oh, okay, that's a white, woman. And their study found that nearly the error rates for darker-skinned women was 34.7% of being mistaken, whereas for lighter-skinned people, it was under 1%. If you want the link to the research or to her TED Talk, feel free to ask me and I'll just send over a document. And even though the model didn't disturb or hurt anyone, it actually didn't hate anyone either. It had simply never properly learned to see certain people, and in this case, Joy was a good example, right? And also, yeah, I'll move on to the next one. So everything we just said was about Google Photos, right? So it was actually a model classifying images, but now what if we actually switched it around and it was us, generating the images, which a lot of us do. For example, I took part in the trend where I made myself as a doll. It was very cute, but so in 2023, another interesting article and research actually, Bloomberg ran a systematic study of Stable Diffusion. So that's a widely used image generator, and they generated over 5,000 images with 14 different job titles across 300 per role, okay? It's a bit confusing, but let me show you. So this is actually what happens. So you have architect, lawyer, CEO, whatever, and you generate 300 images for them. So high-paying professions, such as doctors, lawyers, judges, engineers, were skewed majorly towards lighter-skinned men, whereas low-paying jobs, such as fast food worker, janitor, teacher, was skewed towards, sadly, women and darker-skinned people. So here's the finding that matters the most. It wasn't the model that was reflecting the real-life inequality. It just amplified it. It just took what it saw online and just kind of, represented that in that case. And in the model also itself, we can see that women are actually underrepresented. For example, in high-paying careers such as judge, engineer, there's not even there's only two, maybe one generation of a woman under engineer. And it actually went further than just this. So, for example, they tested 3 crime keywords. So in this case, inmate, drug dealer, and terrorist. And more than 80% of the inmate images and more than half of the drug dealer images were among the darker skin tones. And sadly for terrorists, it was generated men with beards and head coverings. So, yeah. And remember, these aren't edge cases that the researchers actually had to dig for and put aside. These were just the model's default outputs, and it was the first thing that the model actually reached out for. So the model was actually trained on something called Lion, so L-A-I-O-N, and it has over 5 billion image caption pairs, sorry. So obviously nobody's going to curate all these images individually, right? So it took the data based on how people online were actually labeling these. So this was done through alt text, right? So every stereotype was baked again into how people online view certain demographics. So fortunately, there is actually counter work, and this is done by Adobe Firefly. So they're usually trained on licensed and curated data, specifically to control all this. And researchers are also building bias benchmarks for generative models. So, are we bored yet? All good? Yeah? Nice. So case study number 2. This one is actually something that I wanted to understand more on myself, and it's to do with medical AI. So we're all familiar with COVID-19, all privileged enough to actually be alive from the pandemic. I'm going to tell my kids I still had to go to school, so they can't complain. So allow me to share you something more to do with medical AI. So we all know the pulse oximeter, and if we don't, that's okay. It's actually used to measure your blood oxygen levels, and it would, during COVID-19, it was used to determine, okay, should this person be kept under watch? Should they be let go, or should they be kept, for example, in quarantine, and then, they're fine? As in, because it was a respiratory illness. And so this kind of helps frame, right, the importance of the pulse oximeter, and it's very simple. It's nothing to do with AI, right? But in December 2020, the New England Journal of Medicine published a finding. And this is actually quite sad because across 2 large patient cohorts, Black patients were nearly 3 times as likely as white patients to have dangerously low oxygen levels that the device completely missed. So that's a very big mistake. And this was not because the device was experimental, by the way. It's been around for a while. But it was because that they just hadn't taken them into account. So the way the machine works actually is because it has light that passes through the skin, the melanin would actually, skin melanin would absorb that light, and so it would give you the wrong reading. And people were sent home when they should have actually been kept under watch because maybe it was a really serious situation. So keep this device in mind. Yes, it's not AI, but it's actually the ancestor of the problem. And the same mistake is being performed continuously. So, briefly, I want to tell you guys about the Fitzpatrick scale. So it appears in every medical AI dataset. So Thomas Fitzpatrick was a Harvard dermatologist, right? And he built the skin classification system in 1975. 1975 America, by the way. You can imagine how bad it was back then. And here's the first thing worth sitting with. In 1975, it had 4 categories. So it's the first 4 that we're actually seeing. and it was used to diagnose people who had psoriasis and to help them get UV light treatment, right? So the two darkest skin types, which are 5 and 6, did not exist in the original scale until 1988, which was 13 years later. And the skin of most of the people on this planet was not used as a standard. It was actually used as an appendix. So just an addition, by the way. If you want to use it, use it. And over the following decades, actually, this has been widely used to this day. And it's not because it was like correct or anything. It was because, sadly, that was the only data set that people could use until we get this amazing man, Ellis Monk. So in 2022, actually, it was the Monk skin tone scale, my God, was released with 10 tones, which is way better, by the way, than 4 to 6 to 10, right? And it's a genuine improvement. So people have been using this one a bit more, but again, default to Fitzpatrick because not as widely known. But Google has been pushing out this one a lot more, so that's a good thing. So if your measurement system was obviously built for one group of people, then your data will just encode to that particular population, and it will not be inclusive at all. And that's the problem that we still sadly face. And then again, this is a whole different thing, by the way, but this is more to do with when you train one system and use that system somewhere else, that's going to cause issues. So in medical AI, there was something known as the epic sepsis model. And this was used across hundreds of hospitals in the US. And it was kind of rolled out at a huge scale. But then University of Michigan did a study, and they found that the company was lying about the accuracy of the model that they found. And a lot of people had actually passed away from the sepsis. So this is not just a mistake, it's actually a fundamental flaw. And it also counts into something known as transfer. So that's basically when the learned material stays in that machine. And that sadly translates into when the global south receives medical aid for free, for example, certain machines, then it will translate into them getting misdiagnosed and even, I mean, this is a matter of life and death, right? So it's not something very fun. So for example, if a model was tuned on Berlin and let's say Boston, then it would translate badly into clients who are based in Dar es Salaam or even Dhaka. Cool. Have 7 minutes, by the way, and I'm not even halfway. This is bad. So, yeah. That's literally the slides I have to go through, but yeah, I have so many slides, guys. I think I got too excited making the artsiness. Is it 12:40? Wait. Oh, okay. Okay, so I'm good. I had till 11:40. I'm so sorry, guys. Cool. So the ethics compliance and the whole sociology part does come in later, and that's a very interesting part because I work with compliance, and compliance is very fun. So we'll dive into that one. So the third case study, final one, guys, I promise, is to do with money, and money is everyone's topic, huh? I mean, everyone's favorite topic. Yeah. So this is what I'm familiar with when someone says money. In Kenya, Tanzania, East Africa in general, we use mobile banking systems. So for example, you see this little shop over here. You go in, you give someone the amount of cash that you actually want, and they will transfer that money into digital money into your phone number. So, because remember, people don't have smartphones, they actually have the little Nokia phones. So that's a very useful way that they actually use to transfer money to do specific stuff. So, this was invented in Kenya in 2007, and by 2023, it was already processing over 50 million transactions a day. So that was somewhere between $300 billion just flowing in and out. And it's actually how ordinary people in East Africa get through their day-to-day. So that's how they pay rent, that's how they collect money from renters, that's how they pay their school fees, that's how entrepreneurs actually get by. So it's a very complete functioning formal ecosystem that when you mention it to someone in the West, they're very they're very weird about it sometimes because they'd be like, you don't have an application for that? You just go to a shop and tell them and you trust them to keep that money? But that's how it is. And that's basically invisible to Western lending algorithms, right? So this slide is just for fun, by the way. It's to show my pride, the Southeast Asia and East Africa. So Silicon Valley and European fintech companies have been deploying automated credit scoring checks. So this has been across Africa, SEA, and these models usually look for what is to us normal, right? So they look for bank accounts, credit card history, utility bills, and your tax filings. But in economies where most transactions run through mobile money, and where assets are usually shared, for example, land, gold, that's very shared amongst people, these models see nothing. So all they see is an outlier. So they tend to flag economically active and reliable people as uncreditworthy, and that's that's quite bad, obviously, if you think about it. So if you ran these models expecting the key predictors, for instance, credit card age, formal bank account history to be present, then there would be zero relevance, okay, to Western populations. So in this case, what I'm trying to say is the model cannot tell people apart because of how communal everything is. And that kind of brings me to my next fun part, which is, again, sociology and psychology. So Geert Hofstede is actually a Dutch social psychologist, and he created the Hofstede cultural dimensions theory. And his work on cultural dimensions describes how Western societies encode individualism, right? So you have your personal credit card, you have your personal house, you know, everything is under your name if you want it to count as yours. Whereas in other societies, mostly like East Africa, because I have more experience with that, communal financial behavior is basically everything. So everything is shared. And researchers actually have a name for this, which I did not realize until recently, and it's called algorithmic colonialism. And this is basically it in its economical form. So what's being done differently? So a lot of African companies, a lot of African entrepreneurs usually get denied for credit card loans, bank loans, because they're not recognized in Western standards, right, by maybe Western banks. So what's being done differently? In this case, we have people in Africa who open up their own businesses based on this. So we've got M-Kopa, we've got Tala, and we've got Jumo. Yeah, sorry, I forgot the name for a bit. So M-Kopa, for example, has issued over $2 billion in credit to 7 million customers across 5 African countries. So that helps them build credit histories from repayment behaviors and not just bank statements. Whereas Tala uses smartphone data as an alternative and has now served more than 13 million customers. And then the third one, Jumo, operates across Africa on behavioral and mobile data. So basically, how well are they actually paying back their their landlord and so on. So this one has actually worked on more than 30 million people. So that's nearly $8 billion given out as loans. So this kind of tells us that the global south is not a problem to be solved with Western tools. It actually has its own fix to things if you just know how to cater to that particular audience. And these companies have already been making billions, if anything, and are quite well known amongst a lot of the clientele back home. So I just presented to you guys 3 case studies. So the first one being about images, the second one being about medical, and the third one being financial. So these are all different domains, but we've kind of noticed that they all have the same pattern. And these are that the people who built the system did not resemble the people on the system. So basically the system that it's deployed for, right? So the training data did not include these populations and were not predicted. And actually, there's an interesting quote by sociologist and Princeton professor. I hope it's big enough, but I'll read it out anyways. So, zeros and ones, if we are not careful, could deepen the divides between haves and have-nots, between the deserving and the undeserving, rusty value judgments embedded in shiny new systems. And this is actually a book I'm really interested in reading, and it's called Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code. So, let's move on to the next one. And this, so I hid a slide because I wasn't sure if I was going to be on time, but I'll share it at the end. But this is more to do with politics. I hope I don't get in trouble. And in Netherlands, through the 2010s, the Dutch tax authority used an automated risk scoring system to help detect childcare benefit fund, right? And it, without knowing, it kind of targeted families with dual nationality and also families that have an immigrant status or immigrant background. So having a second nationality was literally a risk factor in the model, and roughly 26,000 families were wrongly accused and forced to repay tens of thousands of euros, which basically drove them into financial ruin. And more than 2,000 children, or even maybe 3,000, were taken from their families and actually placed into the foster care system. And the scandal basically was big. It was huge in 2021. And this was not just something that the Silicon Valley all of a sudden, caused. This was in 2010, by the way. It was a state algorithm and encoded ethnic profiling as a mathematical feature. The second one is based in Australia, and this one is quite scary because of how automated everything is going to soon be. And this was from 2016. So in Australia, there was an automated debt recovery system called RoboDebt, which issued debt notices to welfare recipients by matching tax and welfare records. So it reversed the burden of proof and required citizens to show that they actually have money. And it just made a bunch of people kind of revolt and say, why? Like, we don't have to prove the money that we have if we've already kind of paid back everything. So a lot of people actually got back those debts, and it raised unlawful debts against hundreds of thousands of people. And obviously you can imagine what financial constraints can do to some people. And then a royal commission found it was fundamentally unlawful, and the government paid back over $700 million. And then in India, this article actually made me a bit sad because, like, it just makes you a bit sad when you think about elderly people or people that have very limited knowledge in some sense about what is actually happening to them. And so in India, there was something called Aadhaar, and it's the world's largest biometric identity system with over 1.3 billion people. And it denied food rations to some people because maybe their fingerprints did not match, and also authentication fails by certain biometrics, for example, your eye scans, right? So this did not take into account the manual laborers whose some of their fingerprints just completely eroded because of the amount of work they do, and also because the elderly people, obviously cataracts is a thing and can affect, So there are literally documented cases of people starving after being unable to authenticate for the grain they were legally entitled to. I have 20 minutes, right? Yeah, perfect. So that's the end of the very boring case studies, but personally, very fun for me. In every case, so the system was defined as neutral, right? It was defined as objective. For example, the data-driven, the Dutch algorithm wasn't supposed to discriminate. It was literally just data. The RoboDebt was just matching records that it found should be matching. So what we found is that the word objective does a lot of work in shielding the systems from scrutiny. So obviously when an issue comes up, we're just like, oh yeah, it's just the data. Whereas the bias actually fell hardest on the people that are actually being, facing these issues. For example, the people in India. So when a state wraps a lot of its decision around, the language of mathematics, the appeal is no longer against a civil servant, it's against an equation. So for example, you can get someone to fact check something, but if it's against an equation with around millions of people being affected through an equation, it's quite difficult to find out. But yeah. Fun part, ethics, compliance and sociology. So these are defined as frameworks, obviously. So when an industry usually says that they're taking into account AI ethics, it usually means one of two things, that they just want to save themselves, or they actually do care about their commitment to responsible AI. And sadly, a lot of these are usually defined under Western bioethics principles. So that's autonomy, benefits, basically justice, and all of these were developed in 1970s America. I mean, America in 2026 is already a problem. I can't imagine it back then. And I'm not going to say these principles are wrong, but they aren't universal, For example, in Ubuntu, the South African tradition, they center everything around communal well-being as compared to individual rights. So, in this case, an Ubuntu reading of our medical, so if an Ubuntu read the medical AI case, they wouldn't ask, is this an individual's autonomy, or are they being respected in that sense? But it would be more of the sense that, did this system serve the community as a whole? And was it actually helping the people that it was deployed for? So it's usually a different question. Is it affecting one person as compared to, is it affecting that whole community? So different accountability too. So there's also another paper released by Sophia Noble. It's titled Algorithms of Oppression, and she documented how certain Google searches actually gave back very specific responses. For example, if you searched Indian girls, Asian girls, or black girls, you would get very provocative material coming up. Whereas if you searched something completely different, it would kind of obviously give you what the web would expect from these contents. So this is not, again, because Google intended that to be the output or the answer. It was mostly because that's what content was created, and also based on click patterns of people, right? So the algorithm was obviously, again, optimized for engagement. And engagement has also been kind of an issue that a lot of people talk about. If you engage with something online a lot, then you see it a lot more, and that kind of feeds back into the whole living in a vacuum and just having your own confirmation bias. Yeah, move on to the next one. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, so basically, that's true actually. So I think that also comes down to prompting. So I would say that AI itself has several different things. For example, it has the data sets part, so what data you use, and then it will have prompting, so what you ask of it, and it has the training, how you kind of tell it to do certain things, and it has a bunch of small little nuances that come into it. True, exactly, exactly. We don't really have an answer for one thing. Yeah. Actually, it will be interesting to have your opinion after. So after the talk, I'll just come over to you. Always willing to learn, because obviously AI is a very new topic that I'm kind of presenting on. So different perspectives is more than welcome, I guess. Yeah. Um, so the second thing I wanted to focus on was about the EU AI Act, which is led by European regulators. Or let's focus on the OECD AI principles, which were created by a group of 38 countries with a lot of them being from high-income Western democracies, right? So obviously they come in and they say what should and what shouldn't work for AI and so on and so forth. Do you notice anything in the map, actually? These are member states that are part of the OECD AI initiative, and actually there is none of them that are African nations, which is obviously not an issue, again, that is to be fixed today and now, but it is an issue to be aware of and to look into. I think I'm running low on time now. Also, fun fact, the UN actually, uh, the UN High-Level Advisory Board on AI was part again of 39 experts from 33 different countries. But the ones that are usually used specifically for the AI one, AI governance initiative, sorry, are just 7. So that's the G7, if anyone's familiar with that whole group. And that's basically Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK, and the US for some reason. So these rules actually, with these 7 people, 7 countries actually, a lot of the stuff that is being shaped is by these 7 people. So they're actually speaking for literally all these other countries. Um, yeah, so at the start of the talk, I talked about basically that AI is, built on one specific subset. But the right direction is not necessarily complicated. It's just something, again, that we have to be aware of and something that we have to understand. And it just means adding fairness as an architecture and not necessarily an afterthought. So, for example, if you look into cybersecurity, we have transparency. That's a really big thing that nowadays we need to be very aware of, mostly because we need to understand, okay, that our systems, what is actually happening behind the scenes. And in this case, AI also needs to take that into account, right? Next slide. So before I shared all these case studies, I hope that your understanding of what is actually happening behind the scenes has kind of updated. So some of you, I hope that there is now a shift. And usually it starts by just asking 2 simple questions. Whose world is AI learning from? And whose world do we want it to serve? But before I end my talk, I just want to say that there are, from Karen Howe's talk that I attended last week, she did mention that, to be fair, a lot of the AI systems that are being built are equivalent of bicycles. So imagine OpenAI or ChatGPT as a whole being a rocket, and then you have little bicycles. So the little bicycles are basically being used to enhance efficiency and to do certain job roles that you wanted to do. And usually those little bicycles are trained up really well, and they actually have a lot of specific data sets that they use to complete the task. So it's a very fair idea. So if you do make an AI system or an agent, just make sure that you use it with fairness and with the thought that, okay, this is who I wanted to be built for and what I wanted to do, and the data set that I'm using is actually from a wider population. So yeah, that's enough of me rambling. I hope I made sense, guys. That's the biggest thing. Again, if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, please reach out to me. And if you want resources, more than happy to send you over the links I collected. I've just roughly put them into a rough Google document, but if you want, message me on LinkedIn, I'll individually send it. Yeah.